right, today I am very pleased to be able to present a discussion with somebody I'm just getting to know today. His name's Jonathan Snipes, and we've actually communicated in the past because he's a modular guy. He was interested in artcore, and we had some conversations about that. But he came around again when my friend Andrew Benson says, "Hey, you really ought to talk to this guy for the podcast." And he pointed me to his band's Bandcamp site, which was kind of blew me away. And then I started listening to it, and I was even more blown away. And so then I reached out, and he seemed to be more than interested, so I jumped on it. And so with that, I wanted to introduce you to Jonathan Snipes. Hi, Jonathan. How are you?
Hi, Darwin. Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for taking the time. I'm sure you're a busy guy, especially with your band just about to drop a new album. So I'm sure things are hopping for you right now.
Yeah, it's all the stuff that's sort of less fun about being in a band. It's all the stuff that's really time consuming, but isn't actually making any music.
Right.
So it's lots of.
So the band, the band in question is called Clipping, and you're kind of a poster boy or you've become kind of a poster boy for Bandcamp. I was really surprised this weekend when I got the New York Times and there was a thing in there about Bandcamp. I'm like, oh, I'm going to go see what the New York Times has to say about Bandcamp. And like the first thing they said is, you might go to Bandcamp to look at bands such as Clipping. I'm like, get the hell out. I couldn't believe it. So you made the Times through.
Yeah, that was a surprise to us too. We don't. I guess we do best on Bandcamp of all of the sort of distribution mediums and ways that you can get our records. Bandcamp is the biggest seller and the biggest place that people look for it.
Oh, that's interesting. But yeah, it was a real phenomenal thing for me to dig into because what you guys are doing is amazing. Kind of mixing sort of like really serious heavy duty rap with just some of the most incredible sound design that I've heard in that genre. It's really really amazing. So
thank you so much.
Why don't you fill us in a little bit about your part of the band, other work that you're doing, and kind of how you, what your art looks like from your perspective.
Sure. Well, the band Clipping is three people. It's myself and William Hudson, who sort of make the beats, and then David Diggs is the rapper and writes all the words. Bill has a funny sort of metaphor description of how the band works. He says if Clipping were a movie, David would be the star and the screenwriter, and Bill would be the director and would have also written the story, and that I would be the sort of executive producer, editor, and cinematographer. So Bill and I make the beats together. We make them entirely in my studio, and they can sort of begin in any sort of way, but usually Bill never touches the computer. Right, I'm the one sort of doing the sort of nuts and bolts of the editing, even though we both sort of contribute equally to the ideas and the sounds. And usually the sounds are made entirely on my gear in my studio.
Okay, sure, pretty amazing. Now, what kind of tooling do you use? Because when I listen to the work, first of all, in sort of great hip hop tradition, you cast really widely for an amazing combination of samples. But there's also clearly a lot of like home built stuff. There's a lot of things that in other contexts would sound like academic computer music, and you're finding a way to just like slot it beautifully into this sound. What kind of systems are you using to get this done?
Well, there are actually almost no samples in Clipping music, Clipping tracks. Any samples that we use, we try really hard to specifically credit and get full permission. There are a couple of tracks on the Mid-City album that use some samples that are sort of more traditional, but even then, I think there may be two samples on that whole record, and certainly the only sample on our quasi-self-titled CLPPNG record on Sub Pop from 2014 is a Death Pile sample for the track Body and Blood that we credit, and the only sample on the Wriggle EP, which came out recently, is the White House sample that we also credit really specifically. So all the sounds are pretty much generated originally for the clipping project, and it's kind of, I would say, pretty much an equal parts field recording and synthesized sounds using modular synthesizers mostly, but I have a few other sort of analog pieces as well. But the modular sees the most use because it's kind of the most flexible tool. When we started the band, Bill and I started the project originally just as a remix project, taking sort of acapellas of existing rap songs and making new beats underneath them. And our sort of rules, our sort of constrained technique on making these beats is we weren't allowed to use anything that we could classify as a drum sound, and we weren't allowed to use anything that we could classify as a pitch. So the idea was to make really rhythmic noise structures that allowed the rapping to kind of be the metronome, as it were. And we kept those rules when David sort of heard this music and said, "Oh, these should be original songs. These shouldn't just be a remix project." And so he sort of came in, and we kept those rules for a while. And we've obviously broken them many, many times. But that's kind of the guiding principle, is sort of musique concrète and noise techniques used to create rhythmic pop songs with little or no pitch and little or no sort of drum sounds. Yeah.
Well, it surprises me that you say that you use virtually no samples because, I mean, first of all, because what that means is that you're doing a really great job of like your assembly, because there's things that like it somehow seems like, well, I think I've heard that, or maybe I haven't, or maybe I did, you know. But I actually want to ask you a question specifically about samples on I think it's an EP called Something They Don't Know.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
You
That's
actually
an
put a note that says it contains
that
24 samples and will send a free one-of-a-kind edition of one clipping T-shirt to the first fan who can name them all. Did anyone ever get it?
No. People have gotten pretty close, but we haven't. Really? Nobody's called our bluff and made this T-shirt.
Well, I was
about that track. That track we made is kind of a joke to say, okay, well, we don't use samples in our music. Why don't we make a track that uses all the samples? It's entirely samples, and it's they're as obscure as we could make them and as nerdy as we could make them.
Right. Now, so you said that you do a lot of development using both field recordings as well as the modular. Andrew Benson said that you were actually part of the Max meetup that was in LA, and you were kind of doing some real-time DJing using sort of a crazy Max patch. Is that something that you use in general for performance?
Yeah. So every clipping show has been run off the same Max patch that I've been kind of tinkering with and developing since probably 2005 or 6 or something. I used to do a band called Captain Ahab that was it's hard to call it a solo project. I did all the music, and there was another performer with me live. I want to say at the time I started it, Ableton maybe didn't exist or was just really in its infancy, and I was just learning Max, and so Max was the tool at my disposal. So I basically have made myself an incredibly buggy, awful version of Ableton that only I can use. And I've kept using it for clipping because I'm so used to saying, oh, well, what if this knob did this instead?
Right.
And being able to sort of reprogram that, or saying like, well, what if the track had a section in the middle that was random every night? Mm-hmm. Or what if, the way that the files are organized makes so much sense to me at this point, even though, I mean, if I were starting fresh, if I lost everything in some sort of data meltdown, I would probably just switch to Ableton at this point.
Well, I wonder, though, if, one of the things with Ableton is you kind of start with a pretty straightforward DAW or clip launching system, and then you can use things like automation or even Max for Live or whatever to kind of make it, sort of make it buggy, right?
Yeah.
But by starting off with Max, you sort of like start off with the bugs, and then you try and like tame them into being something useful. And I wonder if there's some value in taking that approach to it, Yeah,
and I love about Max, I can't get away from this mindset since I've used Max for so long and used Max so much, starting from the place of, well, what do I want to see on the screen? when I'm playing a show,
Oh,
right?
yeah, of course.
And sort of starting there and then kind of working back from that. So I'm actually in the process of redesigning my monstrosity of a patch from scratch, just sort of starting fresh and rethinking the whole thing and not moving to Ableton, and kind of trying to figure it away. The thing about the band I used to do, Captain Ahab, I was sort of singing and jumping around and also controlling the computer. But since it was just really me that needed to know when the changes were going to happen or what song we were going into or things, I could do really anything I wanted.
Right.
I could do these really I could say, oh, I only want to hear 30 seconds of this song tonight. And I could decide that on the fly. Whereas I can't really do that in clipping because David has to know where we are in the song at all times.
Right.
But at the same time, I'm not singing and I'm not jumping around and I'm not running around. So I can actually do a lot more on the computer. So, so I'm sort of fighting this. I'm trying to figure out how to make sure the songs always sound like the songs, but also to give myself something to do that makes them live enough so that it's interesting to an audience who's listened to the records,
right.
But not so live that David doesn't know what song we're doing.
Sure, that makes great sense, right?
So I've been kind of just rethinking the patch from scratch and trying to keep all those ideas in mind.
So I'm curious, in terms of making the visual interface to what you're going to look at, what are the things that are most important to you?
To sort of instantly know what song we're in and the position of every control, right? Mm-hmm. To have everything kind of streamlined, the things that I need to see as big as possible and sort of take primary focus. I mean, one of the things that I figured out that I really just need is a giant comment box that just contains the set list in the biggest font possible. Like really simple stuff like that.
Right.
Or like I have a giant counter that is the running time of the set.
Mm-hmm.
that's always visible. Because it's slightly different every time, and I have to take all sorts of notes for myself. It's like, hey, only play 2 verses of this song this time, or only play 1 verse of this song, or hey, we're skipping the intro, or right. Things like that are hard for me to remember.
Do you make a lot of those kind of on-the-fly decisions on a gig-by-gig basis?
Totally. Well, and certainly if we tour, definitely, the car ride the next day becomes well, that didn't quite work, did it? Sort of right. Discussion. What if we switch the order of these 2 songs? Or I think I've thought of a better transition between these 2 songs and things. So, and that's the other thing that's really important to me about a live set that's essentially a party, like a rap music party or an electronic music set or anything that we want people to sort of dance to, is that the music never stops also.
Right.
I want things to be like sort of continuously DJ'd, so it's mixed and beat matched and set up like a DJ set, which I think is important and cool. But that means that sometimes, we say, well, it makes more sense for this song to follow this song, but the transition, if we do it the other way, is so much better that let's do it that way. Things like that.
So I'm going to want to come back to some of this stuff because some of the decisions you have to make are actually really interesting to want to dive into. But you said you've listened to my podcast. As you know, one of the things I like to do is kind of explore how people got into things. And again, when I listen to the music that you're doing, I hear influences from all over the place and combinations that are, really unexpected. And as you're talking about some of your band work and stuff, it seems like even more crazy combinations. I'm curious what got you to be the artist musician that you are, and what is the path that you took to get there?
I never really did music seriously growing up. I took a bunch of sort of lessons on various instruments in elementary school and as a young child, and I'm sort of the least disciplined person when it comes to things like practicing or learning anything by rote. Something like Max or programming makes a lot of sense for me. It is very easy for me to be disciplined about because once you kind of learn an idea, you have that idea. It's not like you need to sit and, make a metro object 50 times in a row to know what it does. You know what I mean? There's something in the way that you have to play scales or something, and I've just never been good at practicing or getting
it out
good at like that kind of musicianship. I wish I was, but I think it's something I've come to terms with. for myself, but I'm just not good at that. So music was always a huge part of my life. My mother's a violinist, or was in sort of in some orchestras, I think, before I was born, but never a professional. But there was always music in the house. My dad was a big lover of opera, so I grew up with classical music, going to the opera a lot. And my dad was actually involved in the opera company. I grew up in Riverside, California, and there was an opera company there for a while in the '80s, and he was pretty involved. So we'd have opera singers staying over at our place all the time. So I was always really sort of excited and interested in music, but I never assumed that I would ever go into it. And I actually immediately became sort of excited by theater, and that's all that I did in high school. Basically, is I wrote plays and I acted. And then when I went to college, I went actually to be a playwright to UCLA.
Okay. Upon
Getting to UCLA, I didn't write, I don't think anything, and I immediately got interested in sound design because all this time I was also making sort of electronic music on my computer for fun. And then my sophomore year was the first year that David Beaudry, who you talked to,
right,
taught Max at UCLA in the theater department as a tool for show control and as a tool for theater sound design. And then my sort of worlds kind of collided, and all of a sudden the computer music, the theater interest, the sound design interest, and the programming interest all kind of collided together, and I got really into Max. And at the time, QLab didn't exist, if you know that piece of software. That's of the de facto theater sound design software now, but it didn't exist at the time. And so we were all making our own interfaces, mainly David Beaudry and I, for running theater sound. But we had to make all of the decisions, right, that QLab makes for you about, like, well, how big do you want the cues, and what do you want the operator to see, and how do they stop them, and how do you jump to a cue, and like what. Right. So I did that for a lot of years. I immediately then started doing. I did one sound design at UCLA, and then I immediately got roped into doing semi-professional sort of 99-seat theater sound designs around LA. And at the time, I mean, this is like 2002 maybe, or 2003. Okay. 2002, I think. So at the time, all the sound designs in small theaters in LA were still CDs and cassettes. I mean, nobody had like anything sort of sophisticated like an SFX system, and the idea that you could do these really complicated moves that were repeatable by an unskilled operator was like pretty radical. So I got a ton of work that paid next to nothing, just running around setting up these Max patches in various theaters to do plays. And I was doing, I was using VBAP and doing this sort of spatialized sound. And it was really, thinking back now, it's like probably pretty radical stuff that now is very commonplace to do in theater. But it was all I knew how to do. And I didn't, think I was doing anything that exciting. And that was really my sound design school.
I see. Doing
a ton of productions like this. While at the same time, I was also doing this band, Captain Ahab, that I talked about briefly. That was my kind of novelty dance music project on the side. And then I met Bill Hudson, who's in clipping with me at UCLA. We were in the same class. He went to UCLA Theater School as well, actually to be an actor, and immediately stopped doing that and switched to sound design. And then we lived together all through college and just kind of shared music nerd influence, would go to the record store together all the time and, just sit and listen to records and develop kind of a really like easy aesthetic and an easy way of communicating about music.
Interesting. Did he do anything with Captain Ahab with you, or?
Well, I mean, the occasional thing, just because we lived in the same apartment, like, he would occasionally like help out with the album art. He's actually a pretty talented illustrator, or he would have some funny idea for a song and I would sample his voice really quickly or something like that, but he was doing kind of his own more serious experimental music at the time, playing like free improv. He played musical saw free improv stuff around that time. Wow. We were going to like that Line Space Line event, if you remember that. It was a weekly free improv show. I think I saw Andrew Pask play at it a couple of times, actually.
Sounds about right.
Yeah.
He's deeply engaged in that world.
Yeah, actually I saw a group. Bill played in a group with Andrew Pask, actually.
Oh, wow. Yeah, see, it's funny how the threads of these things start intertwining, and the people that you know from one context all of a sudden crop up in another, right?
Yeah, it's a really small world.
So then how did you go from sort of like a dance-oriented solo project to doing what I would consider a very aggressive hip-hop project in clipping?
Well, I've always been. I mean, even some of the later Captain Ahab records got pretty aggressive. Like I've always been a pretty big fan of harsh noise, and I've played some, some harsh noise and some improvised some harsher sets in my time as well. And I definitely, like, Captain Ahab ended up falling, not because it necessarily sounded like these guys, but because kind of that was my taste. Played a lot of noise shows and then a lot of breakcore shows.
Okay.
And like speedcore and gabber and sort of the harsher world. Those became my friends because that was the music I was into,
Right.
even though Captain Ahab didn't necessarily sound like that. So that influence has always sort of been there. And then when I started doing film music too, that became like film music became a really a place to kind of stretch my chops and sort of exploit all these little weird sort of subgenres of music I'd been kind of getting into and stringing them together sort of into film scores. Definitely in Captain Ahab, I touched on a lot of genres, but at the end of the day, it didn't kind of matter what it sounded like because it was my project. But then when I'm doing a film score and I say, oh, I want it to sound like this kind of drum and bass for a second, then I have to learn how to make that kind of drum and bass, you know.
In doing, when you talk about film scores, are you talking about doing like the backing tracks, or are you talking about doing incidental music, or kind of the whole thing? And what environment was this, like for TV shows or for indie films, or where were you doing this?
Well, I've done all of the above. So while I was at UCLA, I ended up in a lot of classes in the film department in like interactive
Okay, of
film
course,
work.
sure.
And so I met a bunch of film students who would then say, "Oh, you make music. Do you want to do my film?" And so I started doing short films that way. And I've always had a big interest in film music. Like certainly, like in high school, I wasn't like an avid soundtrack collector, and really into the kind of the nerdiest, most bombastic orchestral film music that you can
Right.
imagine.
Sure.
That was
Okay.
really my music. That was my way of like that was my bridging the gap from the opera that my parents listened to into like sort of more popular sounding, kind of catchier melodies, simpler harmonies. Kind of that was sort of my pop music, but still in a like a timbre language I could understand, I
Right.
guess.
Right.
That makes sense. So I
Yeah,
had this
it
huge
does.
sort of knowledge and understanding of film music. And then a childhood friend of mine actually became kind of a pretty successful TV composer. He went through the whole conservatory program at USC, and he got the sci-fi reboot of Battlestar Galactica.
Oh yeah. Right.
And so he was doing that show, and then he got a horror movie, and he's sort of heard the stuff I was doing, the electronic stuff I was doing. He's like, "Hey, let's do this movie together. You want to make loops and sounds and textures and things for me to cut up and turn into cues." We did that, and then he put me on a TV show, which was the Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicles show on
Right. Yeah.
Fox.
Yeah.
So I was doing all the electronics and loops on that. Like he would sort of sketch out a cue, send me the MIDI file and the sort of rough track, and then I would go in and replace all the drums or something more
Interesting. Right.
elaborate, like add a bunch of modular synth sounds and things like that. That connection then then a UCLA connection got me a feature, and then doing that feature and my association with Bear McCreary, the composer who did Battlestar and stuff, started getting me these pretty low budget made for TV movies.
Right.
And then, like a couple of years into that, I sort of looked around and I said, "Hey, I guess I'm a professional film composer. This is all I've done for the past few years."
Right. Right. You come out of the basement and realize what you've become. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And I love film music, and I love doing it, and I had no intention of ever doing this. And I feel a little guilty because so many people, study for years to get to do this, and I just kind of lucked into it. But that's really what happened. I just kind of said yes to everything that came along and and started doing films.
Well, that's pretty interesting. But I think the other thing I think though, I have a strong belief in now that I've interviewed a lot of people, an awful lot of people that have interesting and peculiar tastes in terms of sound design come from some sort of background where they were introduced to atypical music, right?
Hmm.
And so, like your background growing up, listening and being around opera and classical music as the primary household music, set your ear up to be different and to hear dynamics and hear structure in a way that probably is is kind of useful in film composition. I know
Oh,
just
absolutely.
for even
Yeah.
myself, as much as it seemed like a bummer when I was 15, growing up in an environment where I never heard pop music around the house actually really made me open to everything and everything being equally interesting, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so as a result, it meant that I had, I was in a mood to explore at an age where most people really just wanted to hear the top 40. And it strikes me that in your case, hearing particularly opera and the structures of opera and the dynamics and the focus and its attachment to theater and all that kind of
Hmm.
stuff, that probably came in really handy to have that internalized when you're having to do film music.
No, I think so too. And certainly like, I mean, there are things that I might sort of in hindsight want to change about my musical upbringing. Like I missed out on a lot of good stuff too. Like I never heard like Public Enemy when it came out, or
Right, right.
like I didn't really hear Nirvana until Kurt died and things. And there's a lot of stuff that I would have liked to have sort of been a part of culturally that I kind of missed out on.
Sure.
But at the same time, I'm really happy that I have the references and the backgrounds that I do. I mean, I it's funny you said that about like the way that people sort of find weird music. My father actually died when I was quite young. He died when I was 8, but left behind this sort of huge record collection that he had, of basically entirely classical music, really meticulously organized by period.
Mm-hmm.
So Baroque through Romantic through Classical, etc.,
Right.
or vice versa. But yeah, and and so my kind of musical education was literally just going through that record collection and pulling out things and listening to them, uh, sort of essentially based on the covers. And I found some of my favorite music in his very sort of meager 20th century collection, which is kind of where I sort of anything that had sort of a weird or aggressive looking cover or something I didn't quite understand that kind of looked like cool to me as opposed to stuffy.
Right.
I mean, this is how I found Philip Glass, which was that was my gateway into then Steve Reich, and then into books about like that Michael Nyman book about experimental music. And Michael Nyman. Well, at the same time, I was interested in film scores, and the piano came out, and I heard that Michael Nyman track, and so I got interested in Nyman and got his book and learned about Cage and Terry Riley and Lamont Young and Gavin Bryars and all these people that then became, really important for me. But it was really my dad's record collection and his one Philip Glass album that I can remember.
Do you remember
Hearing
what the
that.
cover looked like? That
Yeah,
made you
it's
crack
the
open?
sound. It's a film score. Uh, Again, putting this all in
In
perspective,
context, right?
ties it all up in a neat little package.
Indeed. I
But
planned it this way. Right.
it was the score for Mishima, the Paul Schrader movie,
Okay.
which I've actually never seen, but I remember it. It has these sort of very typical Philip Glass sort of repetitive arpeggios that kind of broke my brain as a young child, that music could be that monotonous and repetitive, and I kind of found it hypnotic and interesting, and really could have got into it. And there's also a bunch of electric guitar on that one, and some drum sets as well as Kronos Quartet and things. So it really felt very weird. And I remember, this is 1990 Riverside, California, pre-internet, of course. So I have no way of doing research on my own. So I went down to the local, warehouse music, and they had one other Philip Glass record, which was that collaboration with Ravi Shankar. I guess it must have been a little later. It must have been, I guess that came out in 92 or 93 or something, called Passages, which then I would listen to that over and over again. And this is sort of how it grew. It's like every time I go to the record store, I'm like, well, now I know about Philip Glass and Ravi Shankar. And so I
Right.
look for, in those two sections and see if there's anything I haven't seen yet. And, that's kind of how it grew. At the time, I had nobody to talk to about this stuff.
Yeah. Do you? I sometimes wonder though if kind of that process and the obsession that goes with it, if that isn't actually helpful too in helping you develop your voice. because like now you can like crack open Spotify, and you can follow these trails, and in the course of a night, you can follow like 20 rabbit holes, right?
Yeah. Yeah, oh, it's I don't know if it's better or worse. It's just different
It's just
now
different,
for
yeah.
sure. I mean, there's something too to be said. Like, there's something weird about the barrier of saying like, okay, well, I have one album that I
Right.
bought
That
this
I'm going to
week,
listen
and
to
I'm just going to
obsessively,
listen to
right?
it. I'm going to listen. I don't like it, but I'm going to listen to it over and over and over again until I do. You know? And that happens so many times, and
Yeah.
that's kind of a great experience to finally get it. You know,
Right.
to finally understand a record that I just don't have anymore. If I hear something and I don't like it, I never hear it again. You
Yeah.
know,
Right.
now, but there's also something nice too about not needing to force yourself to like something. You know, to hear so much stuff and let your taste develop that way. I think it's just different. I mean, I think because of my upbringing, I'm still like sort of fascinated when I hear music that I like really loathe. You know, like if I
Yeah.
hear something that I really just don't understand and it's really not for me and I don't get it and I can't imagine anyone making it and it just baffles me.
Yeah.
I still kind of love that experience and I get really obsessed with things like that.
Yeah. I know. I mean, there are some barriers that I still have trouble breaking. I mean, modern country and western is a debacle as far as I'm concerned. And there are
Yeah.
certain kinds of European drinking music that just makes me want to cry a lot. But otherwise, yeah, I get what you mean. There seems to be nuggets to plumb out of almost anything if you give it an opportunity, right?
Well, and I don't mean like hearing something and saying, I know exactly how this is made. I know exactly what the formula is, and I hate that formula. Like that to me is a different reaction than saying,
Right. Okay.
this sounds like it was made by aliens. I don't understand it at all. Who would have this idea? Like that
Right.
really fascinates me still.
So now I want to talk a little bit more about the process of you doing your live gigs, and particularly this idea of, rather than depending on the typical tools for live gigs, which are either very DJ. I guess when I see most people doing these kinds of shows, they have either a fairly locked down DJ like system, or they have a fairly locked down Ableton Live based performance system, right? And I don't very
Yeah.
often see people in this kind of, because the work you do is very production oriented, really, and it really has
Hmm.
there's a lot of interplay. I know a lot of times your sound design, the interplay between the sound design and the rapping is really tight and really precise. And it seems to me like going out there with a max patch is kind of like, maybe going out with a loaded gun pointed the wrong way.
It's still basically a DJ setup, but
Hmm.
it's just a really crappy one that I made. um, I mean, I'm still playing back files. I
Right.
think probably because of my theater sound background, making max patches to do theater sound, a lot of my max patches are still just like creative ways of deciding what audio file to play.
I see.
You know,
Okay. All right.
and so I am like when I hit play on a song, there are points at which maybe it'll loop forever, but there are points that need to be cues for David to know, hey, I'm going to hear the song the way
Yeah.
it's written in
Right.
order right now. So there are little sort of freer sections, but really mostly what comes out of the max patch is the track as we've made it. I mean, it also, I think I read an interview once with kind of when I was starting out playing electronic music and sort of grappling with the idea of like, well, how live do I want to make this? It feels like cheating to just go press play on something.
Right.
And I read an interview with Mike Paradinas, Musique, who runs the Planet Mu label.
Right.
Was a big influence of mine. And he said, tape music was playback because you've made the track, you've done the work.
Hmm.
He's like, to recreate this electronic music I made live when I'm not as perfect a drummer as the computer, when I'm not, when I can't accurately recreate these sounds. And the point of this piece of music is that it is the same every time and that it has been made perfectly in the studio. He's like, I don't see any problem with that. He's like, if
Right.
the point is that you're playing something live and you're going to hear a live performance as opposed to a live showing of a piece, I don't know. So that kind of changed things for me. That it was like,
Oh, that's
like,
yeah.
this is what it's supposed to sound like. I'm trying to find ways to kind of break clipping tracks apart a little bit and say, well, this element, maybe let's strip this element out for the live show and replace it with this other element. But right now we really are kind of playing tracks back, even though it's a really sophisticated, buggy system to play tracks back that might break at any moment, we are kind of playing them back and then doing layers over the top.
Right. Okay.
So Bill Live has a sort of table of sort of a more traditional sort of harsh noise setup of guitar pedals and contact mics and noise generators and a little cassette deck and things. And there are times when I sort of take an element out of the track and he kind of fills it in.
Got it. Right.
But occasionally he sort of processes the live beat as it's coming out, but he's mostly sort of doing a layer over the top. And then I also, to give myself some more to do, I also have a microphone, and at this point it used to be a little collection of sort of objects that I could amplify, like little twigs and things, but at this point it's basically just a little box of broken glass that I kind of grind a cheap microphone into, and I have a ton of different sort of processing flavors that I can put on that I control on an iPad with Mira.
Sure. Okay.
And that's kind of become my play instrument while letting the beat kind of keep that beat in time,
Right. Well, that's actually a really interesting take. And, the idea, talking about what you learned from Mike P. and then kind of synthesizing it your own way, and now that I think of it, it actually makes a lot of sense because, again, having listened to a bunch of music recently, a bunch of your music, that one of the things that you're actually bringing to the table is sort of like this precision and interplay. And so putting yourself in a live situation where that's not really viable, that's not going to do that's not going to do the listener any good. That's not going to do the crowd any good. It's not going to do you any good either.
Right. And that's kind of how I've come to think of it. But I still think there's more. The new iteration of this patch is kind of revolving around the idea. So far it's kind of working, revolving around the idea that actually what I want is basically two dynamically loaded B patchers with a crossfader between them.
Right.
So that if I want to, each song can be its own max patch with radically different rules and with radically different sounds and things inside of them. Because we use Max in the studio all the time too. I have a ton of little sort of very specific tools that I make on a track by track basis that I'll MIDI sync with Pro Tools or Logic or whatever and record the output of them in, that we could absolutely be using live, that sounds similar enough, but they're played so that it would actually be different every time. That would be really cool. And right now I don't have the capability of doing that. It's very, very hard for me to come up with a system that's generic enough and versatile enough to actually really play all of these songs. So I'm kind of moving towards this idea of two max patches with a crossfader that can be synchronized or not.
Right. That's pretty cool. Good. What do you use for hardware control? What are like the knobs and sliders that are in front of you? What have you decided works?
Right now I have a bunch of. Well, I'm using Mira more and more, which I actually really like. That's the other nice thing. The previous Captain Ahab project, I was running around so much that I'd get so sweaty that I had to be really careful of what I actually put my hands on in front of me.
Okay, sure.
Because I would get to the point where I couldn't use the trackpad on the laptop at all,
Right.
So everything had keyboard controls and everything had knob controls and things. Now I've had the same little Fader Fox DJ controller forever. The DJ2. It's one of the second
That's
generation.
So many people's favorite, though. The people love that thing.
So small and so rugged and so playable. And I've taken it apart so many times and replaced so many knobs and encoders and sliders. I've sweated out that crossfader so many times and replaced it. There's so many jumpers on the bottom of that board at this point because I've torn up so many traces, and it still works. It's wonderful.
That's unreal. That's great.
And I have a couple of other little Fader Fox boards that I sort of switch in and out. Right now, I'm trying out the Keith McMillan K-Mix.
Oh, yeah, right.
Because I wanted I was using a Sound Devices USB pre as my interface because it was the smallest, best, and most rugged thing I could think of.
Right.
But I really wanted more I/O, and so the K-Mix seems pretty good. Also versatile if I can learn how to use those touch faders, which right now I'm having a hard time with because they're very unnatural to me.
Yeah, it's a very different feeling thing, but for the kind of work you're doing, that kind of system, which is kind of a combination of audio interface and mixer and effects unit and router and all that kind of stuff, that makes a lot of sense because it's super versatile depending on what you
Yeah.
happen to choose for your end resulting system, right?
And the routing on it is great too. I mean, the last gig we showed up at, usually, Bill and I run separate lines to the PA, but we showed up at the last one and there just wasn't, it was a kind of all night rave kind of event, and the cable lengths were a problem and the placement and all the usual sort of gig stuff.
Right.
And I said, well, I'll just run Bill through my setup then, and I'll just give you one stereo feed. And it was like a couple of clicks and replug a cable, and there we are, which I've never been able to do before, without having a giant mixer with me. That was that's pretty cool about it. I still accidentally hit the faders all the time. Snap the vocal mic through the stereo mix at Unity for a second, or like turn off everything accidentally because the mic cable falls on the fader or something.
Right,
like
right.
But I think these are solvable problems. I think the system is pretty cool, and when I start using the control layers a little more, I'll get better, certainly.
So are you still doing film and TV music, or are you focused mostly on this band work?
No, I do. I do still do as much film and TV work as I can. It comes and goes, but so does the band work. So so far the schedules have kind of worked really nicely. I've spent a bunch of time this year kind of going back to what I used to do, which is to do like a lot of sound design for other composers.
Right.
Like making loops and patches for soft synths and sampler instruments and things like that, which I haven't done in ages. And I actually quite missed it. I really like doing that stuff. It's very sort of fast and creative and feels very sort of low stakes,
right,
but also sort of just broadens my chops too, when I'm doing my own stuff.
Yeah, I've always enjoyed doing that work too. And the thing that I liked about it is that it wasn't my responsibility to be the editor, right? I could sort of like free-form sound design, and it wasn't my job to say if it fit in a thing or not. It was more like come up with creative stuff, and someone else will make those editing decisions, and I found that really freeing.
Yeah, it's really nice. I mean, it's always still a balance of like, well, what is my taste now, and how do I impose my taste on this? But you can kind of sort of let that sort of go in a way that's kind of cool. And I've never given anybody a bank of sounds and they've used the one that I think is the best. like the one that they find is the most useful is always like, really? That okay. And then I'll hear the score and I'm like, no, you're right. I never would have thought of that. That's great.
Yeah, I hear that. That's actually a great point and something that I think you talk to almost any sound designer and everyone will say, I can't believe they missed this jewel, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the classic story with like some of the classic patches on old synths, like the What the patch was a joke, right? And spawned a whole genre of music.
That's hilarious. It sounds like you're putting together a really interesting kind of career path and bunch of gigs, and it's a pretty impressive set of stuff. What is your future? What is the thing that you haven't done yet that you really want to do?
I mean, I don't know. I don't think I know yet. It's not like I'm sort of chomping at the bit to do a thing that I am not already doing or haven't been asked to do. Typically, if I get interested in something and I want to do it and it's feasible for me to do it on my own, I just do it on my own. Mm-hmm. I'd love more field recording gigs. Field recording has become sort of my favorite pastime, but the hardest thing to make time for. Yeah. I would love sort of a more specific project of someone who says, I'm doing a film set in this place. Go there for a week and record a bunch of sounds.
Sure.
I've done little sort of small versions of that, but I've never had anything really sort of big and systematic, and it almost feels like sort of a retreat. I do so much that's so frenetic, and I have such sort of short attention span and ADD problems in my sort of day-to-day life that going out and sitting in a field for an hour, recording and just listening is a really helpful,
of course,
helpful experience for me. And I can't motivate myself to do something like that without also hitting record.
Oh, right.
So yeah, I've been collecting more and more field recording gear, and I'm getting more and more into it. And honestly, the podcast boom is pretty inspiring to me too. And I love listening to kind of really super designed radio stories. I mean, like the This American Life kind of style an NPR style, but also, I'm a huge fan and devotee of the Kitchen Sisters right now, who are NPR producers as well, who do these really beautiful kind of sound collage, kind of dreamlike pieces with almost no narration and no kind of specific narrative structure in the kind of this American lifestyle.
Okay.
And I would love to start working on that kind of like making work for radio would be a lot of fun. I've never worked in radio at all.
Yeah, well, I think with the sort of destruction of actual radio, all these radio stand-ins are going to get a real opportunity to take a swing at things and try and get our attention. I think it seems like a really good time to be considering some of that stuff as well. So,
and I love the radio pieces that kind of blur the line between journalism and musique concrète.
Right.
I was listening to, I forget the name of the group now, but a French group that was doing these wordless pieces of audio journalism that were just kind of fascinating. These kind of like these field recording pieces that were sort of journalistic in nature, but didn't contain any narration or dialogue or news reporting.
Yeah.
Really, really interesting stuff.
Awesome.
Icelandic group called Scala, I want to say, that really beautiful pieces of musique concrète that are sort of, they're halfway between radio pieces and musique concrète, and I really love that stuff.
Well, there's some really interesting stuff that's been coming out of Iceland, not only from artists there, but also Iceland being really, really forward thinking about bringing other artists in there to do that kind of work as well. It's one of the countries where I just happen to know a number of people who've gotten commissions to come in there and do sonic work or artistic work that is in some way related. It seems like as a country, they're actually focused on that being an important part of capturing their history.
I was lucky enough to go to Iceland last year. We played a clipping show at the last All Tomorrow's Parties festival, which I guess we are technically the last band to ever play an All Tomorrow's Parties. We played last on the last night.
You were there when they pulled the plug.
Yeah, I guess so. But then my wife and I stayed, for a couple of weeks after that, just sort of driving around the country and camping. I did a ton of field recording. It was really wonderful to go to a place that's that quiet. It's really special and amazing. And I know things like the kind of tourism that we were doing was making it less and less quiet, which is always kind of the contradiction of being really
sidebar of
field
it,
recording.
Right?
Yeah,
exactly. Well, Jonathan, I want to thank you so much for taking the time. This was fascinating and really interesting. I hope that people take an opportunity to listen to some of the clippings work. Hope they'll be keeping an eye out for your name running across the credits on TV shows and movies that they see. But I just want to thank you for taking the time and kind of like touring all of the different ways that you think about doing the things you do. I appreciate it, man.
Oh, thank you so much, Darwin. I'm a big fan of the podcast. So it's an honor to be included.
Thanks a lot. And next time I'm out in LA, we'll go out and have a beer or something, all right?
That sounds great. Let's do that.
All right. Sounds good, man. Thank you so much.
Great.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Many thanks to Jonathan for spending the time. It was really cool to hear the kind of creative career that he's put together. Pretty amazing. I want to actually go back and listen to some of these shows to catch his sound design work and his compositional work. But again, remember, you can always jump over to Bandcamp or a few other places to check out the work that Clipping is doing. Other than that, I want to thank you for listening again. Make sure that you keep on telling your friends, family, whatever, to take a listen, catch up on some old podcasts, and keep on keeping on. I'll talk to you next week. Bye.